Hello again, everyone. I'm Mike Goucher. We're at the virtual Lubar Center for our online version of On the Issues. Today, we're talking with the new Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley. The former state lawmaker has been on the job for about a month now, 30 days or so. And he is also the young county executive, just turned 34, and the first African-American county executive in Milwaukee County history. County Executive Crowley, delighted to have you with us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
About what's been happening in our city, in our county over the last week or two. And we'll begin with the protests. And I'm wondering what your take is on the protests. What do you hope will come from what we've seen in the streets of Milwaukee?
I think that when we look at all the people who are coming out protesting, we must understand that a lot of this is because of reaction of what happened to Mr. George Floyd a couple of weeks ago. But this is something that we've been seeing going for far too long. And what I hope is that this will be a turning point, not only for Milwaukee, but for this country. We've seen a lot of violence in general, and we need to make sure that we are protecting our Black men and women when it comes particularly to this type of brutality. And so right now, I'm hoping that we can continue to have deeper conversations with the community, with law enforcement, on how we can better communicate and continue to move this community forward together.
I heard your Sheriff Ernell Lucas on the Upfront show over the weekend. He made the comment to the protesters. He said, "We hear you." Mm-hmm. But one of the things that we're all hearing right now is the calls on the part of some to defund police, to radically rethink law enforcement. Do you agree with the idea of defunding police or law enforcement? How do you stand on that?
I think that when people hear the term defund, they think about taking money directly away, or when they're hearing divest. I think what people are really saying is that they want to see more programming into education, into mental health programs. When you think about a police department, they take the brunt of everything that's happening as a result of not having enough funding for our education system, for our mental health. And so we have to make sure that we are working with our police department and making sure we're investing upfront in communities before it even gets to the point where we have to call the police. A lot of people call the police, as you may see in the news, for very frivolous issues. You know, you see people be calling the police on African Americans who are barbecuing or just bird watching, right? And so we have to look at how we are policing and really do come up with innovative and creative ways to make sure that we're empowering the community. And I think there are some examples out there. I've seen examples about Camden, New Jersey, of who looked at ways of reforming their police department. And so I don't think it's necessarily, just taking what we have currently and just disbanding it totally. It's about how are we being smarter with our investments.
So you're talking about spending money differently, perhaps somewhat less on policing and somewhat more on health or housing or things like that.
I mean, when you actually think about it, here at Milwaukee County, we're not in the best position when you think about the resources, right? And so we have to lean on our state, local state officials and our governor's administration to say we need enough funding for education, early childhood education, funding to make sure we have job training, because those are the best social programs when you think about them. When we can wrap around the services, not only just around the individuals, but families as well. If we can do that early on, we can stop a lot of this on the front end, and we won't have to spend more money on the back end when you think about the investments that we're currently making.
Do you have any concerns, Mr. County Executive, about the expression defund the police, that perhaps that is viewed very viscerally by some people when in fact maybe it's something different than what it sounds like?
I absolutely do. I think that when we hear defund, we think about just taking money away. I mean, we've heard that with even, different issues such as defund Planned Parenthood, for example, right? And so when people think about that, they think about taking all the money away. They don't think about how we continue these services. And that's what we have to think about. We still need to call somebody when things are happening. What does that look like? When you think about defunding or divesting from the police department, that's a conversation that we're going to have together.
How do you think law enforcement, generally speaking, police, sheriff's department, how have they done in handling these protests?
I think they've been doing a great job, to be quite frank with you. Do some things happen? Absolutely. Whether you're talking about law enforcement or whether you're talking about protesters, you're going to have issues I guess you would say, we've been seeing issues on both sides of this. And, not necessarily the peaceful protesters, but those who are coming to agitate in order to make the police officers respond. But here, when you think about many of our officers here in the city of Milwaukee in the sheriff's department, many of them are with us. I've seen many different Facebook posts in support of the protests, and many of them have put in 18 to 20-hour shifts. So I know that they've been stressed as well. And so we just, again, have to make sure that we're having that communication, let them know that we appreciate those folks who work in the department. And, we always talk about good apples and bad apples. I think we have to look at this in a different light. When we look at this, there are a lot of good apples within the system. But if that system, for example, was a COVID infested bag, and you have good apples in that bag, then none of those good apples mean anything. And so it's the system, it's that bag that we have to take a look at and reforming it so we can understand that, one, many of these officers absolutely have a family to go to. They're protecting us. And many of them are doing everything they can to protect and serve. And so, yes, we have to look at this differently at the end of the day.
As the leader of Milwaukee County, you talked about your hope that this could be a turning point for both our community and for the United States in general. In terms of policy, can you give us something concrete that you would look at as the county executive that would help translate the protests we've seen into policy action?
Well, we're actually looking into that. We're looking at what we can do with the sheriff's department, but also, definitely have to continue to lean on our state partners. We have to look at standard operating procedures. We have to look at the policies and procedures of how we, investigate different types of cases that involve officer police shootings. There's a lot that we can look at. I think that we always look at one policy. But when we look at this as a totality and why people are protesting, I mean, it's not just, what's happening with particularly police departments. This is about the system of racism in general. And so, there's a lot of moving parts when it comes down to this. So to come up with one particular policy is hard. But if we want to really make the change, we have to invest in many of these neighborhoods. We have to provide the housing. We have to provide the mental health access. We have to provide them with educational opportunities. But I also think that you also have to think about, okay, what are we doing? Do all police officers have to wear a body camera? Do all police officers have to go through a de-escalation training? Those are conversations that we absolutely have to have. And I think those are policy discussions that are currently being had, not just at the state level and within Milwaukee County, but also with the protesters. It's the 8 that can't wait that they've really been pushing. And I think that's something that we can be doing across the country.
You mentioned just a moment ago the sheriff's department. You're looking at something there. Can you give us some idea of what you would be talking about if you were looking at the sheriff department as an example of change?
Well, it's about working with the sheriff's department. The sheriff is an open and willing partner when you think about making changes and seeing what he can do in order to respond to this pandemic. He is an African American sheriff, and I'm an African American county executive, so we absolutely understand many of the underlying issues that are out there. But also him understanding that law enforcement piece is really about how do we bridge that gap at this moment. And so we're going to continue to have those conversations. It's been tough to have those conversations because they've been out there daily. But there's no doubt in my mind that we won't be able to work with the sheriff's department to figure something out, even if it's in the long term.
I'm wondering whether in retrospect, and I think you said, you were at least quoted as saying that you had some reluctance to support the calling in the National Guard, or some discomfort with the notion of a curfew in the immediate days after the George Floyd death. In retrospect, with the vision of 2020 hindsight, do you think we should have called in the National Guard? Do you think we should have had curfews imposed?
I mean, we won't know, right? But I guess, for me, it was really working with our law enforcement on the ground, talking to the sheriff's department, having a conversation with the chief of police, as well as the mayor and the governor's office to make that call. And it was really about being prepared. And to be honest with you, I think that we made the right call and put parameters out there, because you didn't see the National Guard necessarily on the front lines. You had local police officers in the sheriff's department on the front lines dealing with protesters, because we did not want to escalate this. So I reluctantly support it, and I would say that I'll probably make the same decision. Again, when it comes down to the curfew, again, the mayor definitely had a tough call to make when it came down to that. I was just personally putting it out there that because we were calling in the National Guard, that's already going to be seen as escalation. And so for me, it was really important to make sure that we didn't continue to escalate it. But with the mayor also being in a position at the city, I think that he had to also take into account what his city personnel, as far as his police officers needed, and probably what the sheriff's office needed as well. And so he made a tough call. No, I don't. I wouldn't have put a curfew in only because of what was happening at that time. But again, the mayor had to make a tough call. I mean, I respect the mayor for making the call that he made.
You have talked about your experience growing up in Milwaukee. For people who don't know, you grew up in the 53206 neighborhood, a tough neighborhood in this city. Did you see yourself in some respects in the protesters who filled the streets of Milwaukee over the last week or two?
I mean, absolutely. I've actually been out there to protest myself. And so, many of those who have organized the protests, I've organized with on the ground, and definitely have experienced my own issues with the Milwaukee Police Department. Just full disclosure, I was a part of the ACLU lawsuit against the Milwaukee Police Department. And so for me, I definitely understand the frustration, the anger that they all feel. But for me, it's about making sure that we're working towards a goal. And so we've had some informal conversations about how we can be helpful on the policy standpoint, policy standpoint. But I absolutely do see myself being a part of that, part of the protest. But I'm no different than a police officer and any other elected officials who support them as well.
You're a young guy. I'm an older guy. You're 34 and I'm 64. And so my question is this. When I first came to Milwaukee as a young reporter, I covered the death of Ernie Lacy and the protests that ensued. And a lot was said, and there were a lot of concerns expressed.
Mhm.
And 30 years later, people are still in the streets, still demanding change. Why are you confident that this time it may well be different?
Uh, I think the reason is because now you have everybody from both sides of the political spectrum now having this conversation, particularly nationally. The fact that I heard Rush Limbaugh on a millennial talk show called The Breakfast Club saying that he did not like what happened to George Floyd and he wants to see some type of change. For me, something is being sparked. And when you go out there to these protests, it's not just African Americans, it's not just people of color, it's not just young people. There are older people, there are white people, white males, white women, and their families who are joining these protests. And I think the difference now is that people have heard them and they know that we see them and hear them. But now it's time for us to take action. And I think that's what people want to see right now. And you've seen about 10 days of straight protests here in Milwaukee County and across the country. And I think it's really about what are we going to do? Personally, I think that we have to put the call out is that, as African American, running this particular county now, I have to add, I talk about this, and it's important that I put my perspective out there. But there are some folks who are actually in positions of power who have the luxury of not even having to acknowledge this conversation. And so we have to talk to the Robin Bostons and the Scott Fitzgeralds to get their thoughts, to see what we can do to move forward versus just criticizing what is being put forth by those who have been directly impacted by oppression.
So I mentioned at the beginning of this that you've been on the job about a month, and in addition to the protests that we've seen and the calls for change, we have been still fighting our way through this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Give us your perspective. Where is Milwaukee County today in terms of the epidemic?
Well, we are in a much better place than we were before. I would say, as far as we're seeing the test results, we're seeing things go down a little bit. You're seeing that city of Milwaukee was directly impacted, but now we've seen an increase also in some of our suburban areas as well. But when I say it's getting better, is that the impact right now has directly been on people of color. And we've seen that in the African American community, and we've seen an uptick in the Latino community, and we're slowly seeing that now also in the white community. We're getting better because we now understand what we need to do in order to really mitigate and really continue to flatten this curve. And as we continue to think about many of the municipalities and businesses are opening, Milwaukee County is taking a role of trying to be a convener and working with them and making sure that they not only keep their employees safe, but keep the patrons safe as well, because that's the only way that we can have a healthy economy. You can't have a healthy economy without a healthy community. So we have to continue to work on that. But also when you think about, right now, We are, I think everybody's preparing for that second wave. But I think that we are, in a sense, prepared for that second wave. When you think about what we're doing, as far as the pandemic goes, when you think about how we move forward after the pandemic, how we recovered from this, that's going to be a different question, because the economic impact on Milwaukee County is very extreme right now, the way we're looking at. So we're seeing about $100 million in lost revenue by the end of the year, about a $450 million impact to our total budget in the next year or two. And so we have to continue to lean on the state and the federal government to give us some direct and flexible spending. We had to, we're getting ready to open the zoo now. But that was a loss of revenue. We finally had a reopening of our beer gardens, so it feels like spring and summer in Milwaukee again. And so people are starting to come back. And so I'm saying it's getting better because it's, the tension that COVID has created has really exacerbated everything that we've seen, even the protests, because many of the folks out there, this is the first time in 2 to 3 months that they've been able to be around people. And so when we think about what has been happening related to the COVID crisis, it's extremely important that we understand that not only do we need to figure out how we, manage, quote unquote, this pandemic, but how we get through it, once we actually start to look at, the recovery process.
There's no doubt, even with probably state and federal aid, that you're going to face some tough decisions. Are there certain things that are off the table? Is transit off the table? Are the parks off the table? Are there certain things that you've already said we cannot decimate parts of the county in order to deal with this crisis?
So we have not had that conversation yet. I mean, right now it's really about getting over the pandemic. We have essential workers. When you think about Milwaukee County, we have to be our best when people are at that worst. I mean, we have mental health programs that people need access to that we can't necessarily say we're going to pull back from. We have to make sure that we have the House of Correction and the sheriffs can operate the jails. We have to make sure that we can continue to provide those senior meals. And eventually, when we start to open up, how do we provide those programs for our seniors? And when you think about child protective services and all these other programs other counties have to continue to provide. And more importantly, transit is going to be the backbone throughout all of this when you think about it. So we have to make sure that our transit system is there. They are essential workers, and they've been doing a wonderful job in making sure that people can get to and from work, but also, even managing everything that's been dealing with the protests.
So you served in the state legislature, and you just mentioned Robin Vos and Scott Fitzgerald, the Republican leadership, current Republican leadership in Madison. Every person who is in government in Milwaukee County, in the city of Milwaukee, wishes for what they would consider a better relationship. They would wish for a change in the way they believe the city is viewed by the state. You do have experience in state government. Do you intend to leverage that to try and improve things for your county? Are you optimistic you can improve things in that relationship?
Some people would tell me I'm recklessly optimistic because I'm always optimistic, Mike. And so when I think about, what I've been able to do in the legislature, it's really been about, how we bring more voices to the table. No one person can have all the answers. And I think that when we go to the state, it's about making sure that all 19 municipalities here in Milwaukee County are definitely on the same page. And I definitely understand that, going to the state as Milwaukee County is not necessarily the best thing all the time because we've been the lightning rod politically for decades. But I think that the relationships that I've built with the current Republican leadership and many of the folks who are currently there will definitely be helpful. But Milwaukee County also needs to make sure that we step outside of our geographical area as well. We need to build better relationships with other municipalities and other counties across the state of Wisconsin. The issues that are facing Milwaukee County is not just a Milwaukee County issue, it's a 72 county issue. And we need a statewide strategy to make sure that local governments are getting everything they absolutely need to make sure that we can provide these services for our most vulnerable.
Give me some sense about how this is the events of the last month have affected your ability to carry out the vision you have for Milwaukee County. How are you able to do that given and I don't want to call them distractions, they're larger than that, but given the realities of what you face, how are you able to continue trying to execute the vision you had when you ran for this office?
So when we think about, COVID-19, what it really did was really exacerbate everything that we have been talking about. When you think about Milwaukee County focusing on racial equity, and you think about the health disparities, education disparities, largely those fall across racial lines. And what we've seen with COVID-19 when it first impacted Milwaukee County is it really exacerbated it because we've seen how it was directly impacting people of color. And I think that everything that I talked about, bringing more people to the table, building bridges, we need that now more than ever. When you think about the COVID-19 crisis and how to flatten the curve, we need everybody to rise to the occasion of making sure that we're practicing physical distancing. And I say physical distancing because we need people to stay socialized, to continue to socialize with folks, because people have been stuck in their homes and need that type of interaction. But making sure that if you do go out, we encourage you to wear a mask, and don't be afraid if you see a Black woman or a Latino man wearing a mask. Don't be afraid, right? Because we understand that those biases are still out there. And so I think that we're getting to a point. I mean, it's going to be difficult because of COVID-19 and the economic impact. But I think that as long as we all understand keeping that same spirit of we're all in this together to mitigate this pandemic, we'll be able to move this community forward even further when you think about where we need to go.
You called yourself recklessly optimistic, and I looked at the board right over your left shoulder there. It's a good day to have a good day. Is that the Crowley family motto?
It is. It's a Crowley family motto. My wife says that. My dad, anytime you ask him how's your day going, he says every day's a good day. And when you think about everything that's going on, you have to always. I try to look at the glass half full, and it's about how do I walk forward this day and making my contributions to the world. And I think not only my wife, my family, my three girls, but those who have mentored me and my parents really have adopted the fact that we have a part to play. And we just need to make sure that we stay in good spirits, because that's one of the most contagious things out there is a good smile. And so, if you really want to move this community forward, you got to come together. And that's what it's about.
David Crowley is the new Milwaukee County Executive. Been on the job for about a month now. Mr. County Executive, we appreciate your time today. Thanks very much for being with us. And thanks to everybody watching this online version of On the Issues. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.